I lost my dad 2 years ago while we were out camping. I'll never forget anything about that day. It was an early morning in mid-October, and as usual, Dad was ready for the annual camping trip. "Son, get up, get dressed, and let's get a move on," Dad said. My eyelids peeled open slowly as my body booted itself on. "I'm up, Pops, just got to get my gear together," I said. "Be down in 15. I lied. I got dressed, grabbed my bag, and headed downstairs. Dad was outside checking the engine on the truck, and Mom was watching the news in the kitchen. "Dad said send you out when you came downstairs," Mom said. I ran over to my mother and gave her a kiss on the cheek. "Love you, Mama, I'll see you in a couple days," I said. She said it back, hugged me, and shooed me off. Dad was getting the last bit of the equipment packed, so I decided to put my stuff in the car and wait for him to finish. "Son, come help me with this," Dad said. I made my way over. "What's wrong, Pops? You getting too old for this?" I laughed. "They'll never be too old to whoop your ass." He laughed. All of a sudden, my father's demeanor completely changed. "Tony, if anything ever happens, son, never go camping again," he said cryptically. "What's that supposed to mean, Dad?" I said, but he ignored me and kept going. He acted like he didn't just say that to me. I kept loading gear and just ignored it. I helped him with the rest of the equipment. We loaded it all up and got into the truck. My dad was a very kind man. Give you the shirt off his back kind of guy. He was funny, caring, and made you feel like you could conquer the world. He was also quiet and standoffish at times, which I figured was his military service bleeding out. He never really talked about it, but Mom would always say Dad came home after the war ended, but his mind is still at war. Some nights he would wake screaming, and I'd hear Mom promising it was all okay and he's okay. But for the most part, he was an amazing man who treated his family like royalty. "So, kiddo, are you ready for this year's camping trip?" Dad asked. "Of course I am, Pops," I said, lying straight through my teeth, but I couldn't let him know that because it would crush him. "I'm 16 now and I have a girlfriend. This is getting to be kid stuff to me, but I love my dad and I know what this means to him. You sure you're not upset you have to leave your little girlie back home?" He joked. I brushed off the comment and sighed. He laughed and continued to drive out to the campsite. It took us about 4 hours to get out there. It's out in the middle of nowhere, California. Nothing but high trees and higher mountains. Our campsite was situated right on the side of a cliff. I began to pull the camping stuff out of the truck. I noticed my dad pacing and muttering under mid-breath. He made his way around the area, checking things out. He seemed a little agitated, but I brushed it off and kept pulling things out. An hour or so later and camp was set up. It was about 3 p.m. at this point, and we were starting to get hungry. "Let's get down to that river and get us some dinner," Dad said. I agreed, and we made our way down to the river. It was a 5-minute hike down from our campsite to the water. When we got down to the river, I noticed the cliff our campsite sat on overlooked it. The river was quite violent, churning rapids loud as plane engines. The roar could be felt in your chest. My father made his way down the river to a split-off that ran into a creek. He explained the slower water was perfect for catching fish, and then he froze. Abruptly, his voice stopped. I looked over and noticed Dad was staring into the woods and whispering something to himself I couldn't make out. His eyes so glazed over I'm surprised tears didn't begin to fall. I could hear him saying what sounded like, "this last time," but I wasn't sure. I made my way closer to my dad. "Dad, are you okay?" I said, but he didn't move an inch. I looked out into the woods but seen nothing. I reached out to grab his shirt. "Dad?" I fearfully asked. Fingers outreached, trembling towards him. All of a sudden, he snaps out of it, twisting his head towards me, smiling. "The slower water is perfect for catching fish, son," he said, his head twisting slowly back towards the river. I was quick to notice that this episode looked a lot like the symptoms of my father's PTSD, but he immediately snapped out of it. I was creeped out, to say the least. The way he turned his head back towards the water scared me a little. I've never been afraid of my father, but that scared me. "Son, hand me my fishing pole. Let's see if we can get us some grub," he said. I handed him the pole, and we began to fish. We caught what seemed like 100 fish. It basically turned into sport, seeing who could catch the most. The entire time we were fishing and laughing, the episode played in my head on repeat. I tried my best to just forget it and enjoy the day with my dad. We went back to the campsite after fishing for a couple of hours. We scaled the fish, gutted them, and skewered them on some branches and began to cook them. Dad grabbed a beer out of his cooler, sat down with a piece of wood, and began to whittle it. I stood at the cliff and looked at the river. I grabbed a rock and chucked it down into the water. I'd say we were about 75 feet up, but I wasn't sure. I turned and looked at my dad, wanting to question him about what happened today, but I couldn't. Maybe I was too afraid to trigger his PTSD. I'm not sure what it was, but I couldn't. Dinner finished, and we sat down to eat. Besides the creepiness of the day, I'd say it went pretty well. Dad cleaned up the dishes, and I started to gather more wood for the coming day. By this time, it was about 8 p.m., and we were winding down. "How was your dinner, son?" he asked. "It was awesome, Dad. Thanks for cooking." I said. He shot me a thumbs up and started whittling the wood again. "Hey, Dad, what happened to you on the river today?" I worriedly asked. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You froze up, Dad, and repeated something you just told me." I said. "Froze up? What are you talking about?" he asked, agitated. "It was nothing, Dad. You must not have heard me." I said, "I haven't been sleeping very well, that's all. Don't worry about it, okay, son?" he said, calming down. He gestured over to his sleeping bag. "Emma hit the hay, son. They'll wake you up early morning so we can go hunt," he said. "All right, good night. Love you, Dad," I said. He disappeared into his tent, and I did the same. I fell asleep quite fast from the activities of the day. All of a sudden, I'm woken up to a scream. Not just any scream, but it sounded to me like the scream of someone being tortured. As soon as I sat up in my tent, it went quiet. No bugs, no fire crackling, no river, nothing. I unzipped my tent slowly and stuck my head outside. It was pitch black outside except for the glow of the moon on objects. I climbed out of my tent and made my way to Dad's tent. I unzipped it and stuck my head in. "Dad, are you okay?" I said. All I could hear was my father mumbling in his sleep. My father was having a conversation with himself. "You can't take them, they're my family," he whispered. All of a sudden, a voice came out of my father that couldn't have been his own. A deep guttural voice, almost demon-like. "I will take you, then I will take them." It growled. I stumbled backwards out of the tent and fell to the ground. "Tony, are you okay?" Dad asked, peeking out of the tent. "Yes, sorry, Dad, I was just checking on you." I said. "Are you okay, Dad?" I asked. He shook his head yes and told me to go back to bed. The rest of the night was calm. I laid in bed for an hour or so playing what I just heard over and over again in my head. I'm not sure what to chalk it up to, but I was almost certain that wasn't PTSD. The following day, it was pretty normal. We hiked around some, fished some more, and gathered wood for the night. He didn't say much all day and seemed irritated. All in all, another good day. I dared not ask Dad about what I heard him say in his sleep. I'm not even sure he would have told me. "All right, son, I'm out," Dad said. "Love you, Pops. See you in the morning," I said, not knowing that was the last thing I'd ever say to him. When I got into my tent, I could feel anxiety creeping up my back. The events of last night burning into my memory. I forced myself to stop thinking about it. I began to tell myself to calm down and man up. All of a sudden, a noise that I can only describe as bones and meat squelching moved through our camp and towards the cliff. I stood up and looked around in the darkness. That's when I noticed it. A silhouette of my dad standing completely still on the cliff's edge, whispering and looking down at the river. I gasped in horror and began to sprint towards my dad. I got about 10 feet behind him and froze. I could finally hear what he was saying. "You can have me, but not them. This is the last time you hurt me," he said, whispering. "Dad, are you oh?" Before I could even finish the thought, my dad looked back at me and said, "Never agree to go camping again, son," and he leapt off of the cliff. And oh, I screamed. The shock I felt almost made me pass out. I stood there emotionless, not understanding what just happened. Feelings slowly coming back to me, I began to sob. I ran to the cliff's edge, but there was nothing I could have done. Staring into the darkness, listening to the roar of the river below, reality began to set in. I need to get help right now. I grabbed the keys and hopped into the truck and drove all the way home to get help. I drove home in shock. I could swear I kept seeing my dad in the back of the truck. The entire 4-hour drive was a blur. I got home and rushed to my mother, and explained to her what happened. She collapsed and began to sob. We called the authorities and they went out a search. Not a single trace was found of my father. It was like he disappeared. That was 2 years ago. I'm 18 now, and it's coming up on our annual trip. I haven't gone in the last 2 years since I moved after that. I'm going up to stay with my mom for the weekend. The night I got there was the night before the annual trip. I got in, greeted my mother, and had dinner. That night, I woke up to a cold chill running up my back. I opened my eyes and stared around the dark room. It was so quiet in the room it frightened me. A whisper broke through the darkness. "Son, get up," it whispered. I sat up on the bed and rubbed my eyes. That's when I noticed it. A person's face looking at me from the bottom of the window, looking into the backyard. More specifically, my father's face. His skin was paper white and his hair was matted. His eyes were black and evil. He began to speak in a quiet, deep tone. "Son, are you ready to go camping?" he said, raising a hand and tapping on the window with his long, sharp fingernails. Tap, 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 his fingernails rhythmically tapping the window pane. "I've missed you all this time, son. Why did you leave me?" he cried. He began to open his mouth wider than anything I've ever seen, his cheeks tearing straight to his ears and his jaw hinging open. I jumped out of bed and flipped back to look at the window. I stared in absolute horror, frozen by what I was looking at. I didn't say anything. I couldn't say anything. I backed away slowly and his eyes followed me. I flipped the light on and it's gone. I run from my room straight into my mom's. "Mom, are you awake?" I asked, frightened. "Yes, I'm awake, son. What's wrong?" she asked. "Mom, we need to leave right now. Something is outside in it." Just then my mom cuts me off. "He can't get you, son, if you don't agree to go camping," she said as she rolled back over and went right back to sleep. "Mom, what the hell is that supposed to mean?" I yelled, but she ignored me. Confusion and anger had set in at this point. What was going on? This is crazy, I thought to myself. Did I really just see my dead dad staring at me through the window? I decided to step outside and see for myself. I'm not going to be able to ever sleep again if I don't figure this out. I walked around the house to where my window was, and nothing was there. Just the woods behind our house and nothing more. "Want you go camping with me, son?" A voice called from the woods. "Want you, please?" I stopped moving and slowly turned to look at the woods where the voice came from. "I'm going to get you, just like I got your dad," it yelled in a piercing screech. Just then a bright white figure completely naked on all fours scuttles out of the woods towards me and begins to scream horrible screams. I fall backwards on my ass and close my eyes, waiting for the inevitable end. The screams getting louder and louder until they're almost right on top of me. I feel long fingers wrap around both of my ankles, fingernails digging into my calves. This is it, I thought to myself. The thing that killed my dad is going to kill me, then my mom. As soon as the thought entered my head, all I could hear were my dad's last words. "Never agree to go camping again, son." I snapped out of it. "I am not going camping with you." I screamed at the top of my lungs, my hands covering my eyes. Silence. I pry my hands away from my face and look up, expecting to be met with some horror. Nothing was there. No sign that anything had even been there. At my feet was a small wooden cross with the words "Father" and "Son" carved into it. The cross my father whittled. I picked it up and keep it with me to this day. I'm not sure if I'm going crazy or not, but I know this for sure. I'm never camping again,